Hi, so it's Julie again, part two of stress. We're just going to look at methods of treating stress now. So we're going to start off by looking at cognitive behavioural methods, one of which is called stress inoculation training or stress inoculation therapy. So created by Mike and Baum in 1985, you can't. So the premise behind this is a cognitive premise, a bit like Albert Ellis with his ABCs, basically saying you can't necessarily control the stress, but you can control how you see it. You can't control COVID, but you can control how you see it. And so if the idea of an inoculation is a bit like we all have, we're waiting for vaccines now for COVID. So it gives you a little bit of the disease so that you can build up immunity to it, and that's the same as the approach that Mike and Baum took. So there were 3 stages. You would do this with a therapist. So the conceptualization stage is where you go to the therapist, you kind of establish that relationship, you understand what stress is, a bit like we've done in this session, and why it happens and what it means, but you might also at this stage discuss what your stresses are and why they are stressful. And then kind of the therapist, and this is why it's kind of called training, the therapist teaches you coping skills. So they might teach you meditation, or they might talk to you about emotional and problem solving, coping mechanisms. They might talk about if you're stressed about going for job interviews, they might even rehearse with you job interviews. So they might actually rehearse some of your belief structures. So if you're going for a job interview and thinking, oh, I'll never get it, they might work with you on reframing into more positive beliefs, but they might also practice, say, come to a session dressed as if you were going for an interview and give you feedback on that. So you do that in the safety of the treatment room, and then you go out into the world and you give it a go. So you go for that, the interview, or you might do a role play interview to build up to that. So you put it to the test, but obviously then you always come back and go, well, how was that? And so it's kind of an iterative process. So this is obviously without drugs, so that means that you don't have to wait to be prescribed it. And systematic desensitization isn't something that we've looked at yet, but that's used with phobias. So if you're scared of a spider, you might start off by looking at a black and white pencil sketch of a spider, and then you might look at a black and white photo of a spider, then you might look at a colour photo, and then with the client you would work as a therapist to say, okay, what's the next step you feel like you can take, and how far do you want to go? So some people might say, well, I just want to be able to be in the same room as a spider. Other people might say, well, I want to be able to hold a spider. And so you would build up those slow steps together and kind of relax at each step. So that's systematic desensitization. And this sit as well, it kind of worked better for some phobias, very specific phobias, and can inoculate against others, because obviously once you've learned how to think positively for an interview, you can apply that to other situations where maybe you're thinking negatively. So you can inoculate for the future too. So he, and Horan used stress inoculation with students for 90 minutes. You can see they're quite long sessions, and they found that it did reduce stress and anxiety, so therefore improved exam performance. Because obviously when you're stressed, you can't use your neocortex, you can't think, so you're less likely to do well. However, it requires time, effort, and motivation, but also money. It's not usually available on the National Health. You can see their 90-minute sessions for 4 weekly sessions, so that's a significant amount of time and a significant amount of money. And you've got to want to do it, because obviously you're training, it's like any type of training. The subjects at school that you hated, you probably paid no attention to, and so you weren't bothered about it, whereas the subjects that you wanted to learn about, so you've got to be invested in it for it to work. So the skills taught might be better than the specific thing. So if I teach you how to think more positively, or if I teach you how to relax, it might be those skills that are the most valuable thing. Okay, very similar to and kind of in addition to this is hardiness training. So this obviously links to Cabassa's work. So the Cabasa believed that we could be taught to be hardy. So remember, it was challenge, commitment, you know, the 3 C's that we talked about. So Maddie founded the Hardiness Institute in California to increase self-control. And they both suggested ways of training for hardiness. So they'd focus and get people to relax their heart rates, to bring them down, to calm them down and identify the sources of stress. And then with the therapist, they would work on their coping style and analyze their response to see whether they were, you know, how could you think about it as a challenge, not a problem? You know, how committed are you to dealing with this? And then, you know, you'd get your self-improvement from that. So again, training was done at Utah State Valley College, and it helped people to continue in college. Also been used effectively with Olympic swimmers to improve their performance. Again, however, you've got to want to do it. You have to be committed to doing it, and the same things. It's not a fast thing. But all of these, obviously, because they're cognitive and behavioural. You're not using any drugs, so you're completely in control of it. You can do it as much or as little as you want to. Okay. Obviously, there's some situations where we do need drugs. So benzodiazepines tend to be, well, we'll have a look at them in a minute, a treatment. So if a friend of mine was suddenly bereaved and the doctor gave her benzodiazepines, and just said, if you can't sleep, if you're having a panic attack, you can take these. So what they do is they work on the central nervous system, and they actually interfere with GABA. So GABA is a neurotransmitter responsible for anxiety relief naturally in the body. So this is something that our body naturally produces, which helps us feel less anxious. So basically, benzodiazepines work with our natural body responses, because this is neurological. So this is part of our brain. These are not hormones, these are chemicals which are produced within the synapse. And so these enhance GABA. So basically what they do is boost what our body can do anyway. And they also reduce serotonin in the brain, as this is a neurotransmitter which causes arousal. Now that can seem contradictory, because we think of serotonin as, and serotonin it makes us feel happy, alive, vibrant. But if you think about the signs and symptoms of anxiety and then compare them to how we feel when we're excited, they're the same kind of, you know, heart beating, flushed, you know, we might feel shivery even if we're excited. And so actually slowing down serotonin can release and reduce some of our anxiety. Okay, so they work on within the nervous system, in the neurons, in the synaptic ventricles, where we're producing these neurotransmitters. They're slowing down our serotonin and increasing our GABA to give us less stress. Yeah, we've already talked about these things and the effects that they can have. Now, beta blockers work in a different way, and beta blockers can be used for crisis situations. So, for example, if you've got to get on a plane and you hate flying, or you've got to give a big speech, because beta blockers, they actually reduce the activity of adrenaline, because they bind to the receptors on the heart, and which would cause you to be aroused. So they're actually working within the cardiovascular symptoms. So they slow down the responses to stress. So they'll slow down the heart rate, the breathing. And so because they block those receptors, adrenaline doesn't have the same effect. So our heart, you know, doesn't go so high. Our blood pressure slows down. So actually, beta blockers are something that are sometimes given in emergency situations, because it can bring the heart rate down. So, you know, drugs are effective. You can't, you know, beta blockers in a crisis situation, if you've got to get on a plane, and benzodiazepines, they work. You know, you can get them over the counter at the doctor. you have to have a prescription. So Khan et al. Used 250 participants over 8 weeks and found that BZs were superior to a placebo. So what a placebo is like a sugar pill, and they're usually done in double-blind tests where the researcher knows what the red pills and the blue pills are, but the research assistant doesn't know what red pills and blue pills are, so they're blind. And then the participants, some taking red, some taking blue, they don't know what they are, so they're blind too, so there can't be bias. And then they look at the results, and they found here that the benzodiazepines work better than the placebo effect, better than other antidepressants. Beta blockers kind of are useful where we need stamina. So for example, if we're playing golf or snooker and we don't want to be shaky, or if we've got to get up and do a big speech. It's obviously easy to use as long as you remember to take them, and you don't have to put the effort in like you would do for this, sick. However, BZs are addictive even at low doses, and there can be withdrawal symptoms. So these really need to be taken under supervision, and they would build them up and take them down. Ashton recommended taking them for no more than 4 weeks, so you can see how strong they were. And the side effects can lead to aggressiveness and cognitive impairment, and the difficulty in storing new knowledge. So, of course, that can be a source of stress in itself. If you're feeling aggressive and having arguments with everybody as a consequence of that, then you're going to be increasing stress. Or if you're thinking, you can't think as you would normally be able to, that can increase stress. Some studies have also linked beta blockers to diabetes, and of course the effects of the drugs only last as long as they're taken. So it doesn't, of course, they solve the symptoms, but they don't deal with the cause. So for example, let's take, so we know domestic abuse is on the rise at this time, and it's been high for a long time. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 children will witness domestic abuse, and 1 in 4 women will experience it. So let's take that as an example. So we've talked about how meditation can calm you down. Now, should we teach someone in an abusive relationship to meditate? Well, you might argue yes, so they can get to sleep at night. You might want to give them BZs because they're anxious all the time and you want to calm them down. But actually, don't you want them to get out of that relationship? So you want them to you might teach them to meditate, and you might give them some of these drugs in the short term so they can think clearly, so they can engage with some of the stress inoculation therapy, or with some of the support services around domestic abuse, so then they can make the decisions they need to get out of that situation. But obviously, when you're completely stressed, you can't think straight, so then sit or Hardiness training is not going to work because you're beyond that, because your neocortex isn't working. So I'm just going to pause the recording. Hi, so we're just going to finish up with a little more detail on the Hardiness stuff, because it's a way of understanding stress, but also a bit more about the treatment. So we've already talked about the 3 C's, so we won't go into that any more detail. And we've looked at how did she get that research? So she looked at 670 male American middle and senior managers, looked at their recent experience, and then looked at absentee levels and looked at the link between those 2 things. So they didn't all respond in the same way, and she got interested, as we've already said. Now, Maddie also did the one that we've looked at with 400 managers at a time when this big company was undergoing massive changes. So there was a whole restructuring, and it was extremely stressful, because remember, the health and safety executive, things about change can be really stressful in the workplace. But what they showed is that at that time, 2/3 of the people, really, their performance went down. There were heart attacks, there were serious things, there were strokes, they were depressed. But a third seems to flourish, and they were kind of curious about, well, how come, what? And they found that they were the ones who were seeing it as a challenge. They were committed, they were going in there seeing it as an opportunity. So although Cabassa's research was done on wealthy managers, that you could say, well, they were male, they were of a certain standard, so they're not, can't generalise to the other population. But there has been other research done on soldiers, firefighters, that back up her findings. Obviously concerned because they were looking at dangerous levels of stress, but on the other hand, they were natural situations. Kind of, this seemed to suggest that it didn't necessarily link with type A and type B. So the third bullet point about you couldn't say, oh yes, it's type A people who are more this and type B people who are more like this. And then Paul Bartone measured hardiness and looked at people applying for armed forces and found that those who passed the course were more hardy than those who didn't. And no surprise that the army would want hardy people in there. And so they looked at studies of US soldiers in the Gulf War and identified the personality type of hardiness as being really important, contributing to soldiers' health and well-being. And part of the training is obviously you know, the military use aspects of the hardiness approach. Results in recent operations in Croatia, Saudi Arabia and Bosnia confirm that soldiers high in personality hardiness show fewer stress-related ill effects. Hardy soldiers appear to be psychologically well equipped for peacekeeping operations, which frequently entail situations of great ambiguity, isolation and restriction over movement. Notice that's peacekeeping operations. That's not the same as full-out war. And certainly what I wouldn't want you to take away from here is that therefore, you know, people with PTSD, well, it's their own fault, they just weren't hardy enough. No, that, you know, as I've said, trauma is something significantly different. Okay, so you're thinking about the way that, I'll just stop sharing now and come back to, because it's coming to the end. So today we've looked at biological explanations for stress. We've thought a bit about stressors. You've understood some of the cognitive ways in which we can be stressed. We've looked at some of the treatments for stress. Now, lots of you were talking about your various projects, so hopefully you can see how this links in. And in terms of psychological approaches, obviously you can see this links into the biological approach because we've talked about neurotransmitters and adrenal glands and etc. The biological approach, but you can also see there's a cognitive element because it's to do with how we perceive things and whether we perceive the demand greater than our ability to meet that demand. But there's also behavioural bit here about what stressors, what can we do? So that's back to maybe the coping. If you look at, you know, do I get my car fixed, which would be behavioural? Do I go and get a hug? So that would again be behavioural, relational. So kind of those three things are definitely in there. If that helps you to link it into your project. So that's all. Please leave questions if there are any.